Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Murder at the lantern lighting ceremony. Welcome to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, and tonight I have a tale that will remind us all how even the most cherished traditions can harbour darkness beneath their glowing surface. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Do you remember the first time you witnessed hundreds of lights ascending into a winter sky? Perhaps it was fireworks or lanterns at a festival, or even just stars emerging on a clear night. That sense of wonder, of beauty rising toward heaven itself. Share your memories in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing how light touches our lives in unexpected ways. Now, settle in with your evening tea, and let me tell you about the night St. Mary Mead's lanterns carried more than just wishes skyward. Chapter 1. The lanterns rise at twilight. Miss Jane Marple stood among the gathering crowd in the village square, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag as she observed the final preparations for St. Mary Mead's annual Christmas lantern lighting ceremony. December 20th had arrived with a crisp clarity that seemed designed for such occasions. The air cold enough to see one's breath, but still enough that the paper lanterns would rise unimpeded into the darkening sky. The tradition, now in its 43rd year, had evolved from a simple candlelit procession into something rather more elaborate. 217 lanterns, each handcrafted by village residents, waited on specially constructed stands arranged in concentric circles around the square's ancient oak tree. The paper globes glowed faintly in the twilight, their Christmas designs of angels, stars, and holly visible through the delicate tissue paper. "Such a lovely evening for it," remarked Mrs. Bantry, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow with her characteristic enthusiasm. "Though I must say, Gerald Blackwood's lantern rather puts the rest to shame, doesn't it?" Miss Marple followed her friend's gaze to where a particularly ostentatious creation stood apart from the others on its own decorated pedestal. The lantern was easily twice the size of its neighbours, adorned with genuine gold leaf that caught the last rays of sunset, transforming the paper globe into something that seemed more treasure than tradition. £200, I heard, Mrs. Bantry continued in a lower voice. Can you imagine? For something that will float away and likely end up in someone's garden pond by morning? Mr. Blackwood has always been one for grand gestures, Miss Marple observed mildly, though her keen eyes had already noted how other villagers gave the businessman's lantern a wide berth, as though its very extravagance offended their sensibilities. The crowd was growing now, families arriving with children bundled in scarves and mittens, their excited chatter filling the square with anticipation. Dorothy Fletcher, this year's ceremony organiser, bustled about with clipboard in hand, her normally cheerful face drawn with the concentration of someone determined that everything proceed perfectly. Thomas Reed, the safety coordinator, made his final rounds, checking that fire extinguishers were properly positioned and that the launching area remained clear. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had worked outdoors all his life, and Miss Marple noticed how his jaw tightened whenever his circuit brought him near Blackwood's golden lantern. Sarah Mills emerged from the village hall carrying a box of matches, which she distributed to the designated lighters with practiced efficiency. The craft instructor had supervised yesterday's lantern-making session, and her pride in the collective achievement was evident in her satisfied survey of the assembled creations. Harold Price moved through the crowd with his camera, documenting the preparations with professional dedication. His photographs of previous ceremonies adorned the village hall, a visual history of St. Mary Mead's attempt to guide Santa's sleigh with ascending lights. 5 minutes to lighting, Dorothy Fletcher announced through a crackling megaphone. Please ensure children are supervised and maintain safe distances from the launching area. Gerald Blackwood himself appeared from the crowd, resplendent in a cashmere coat that probably cost more than most villagers spent on their entire Christmas celebrations. His wife Catherine followed a few steps behind, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. As the church clock began to chime 7, Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the ceremony and the faces of those participating. In her considerable experience, moments of public spectacle often revealed private truths, and something about tonight's gathering had awakened that particular sensitivity she possessed for detecting undercurrents of tension beneath surfaces of celebration. The first match was struck, its small flame seeming impossibly bright in the darkness, that had now fully claimed the winter evening. Chapter 2: Fire Falls from Heaven. The ceremony began with the lighting of the children's lanterns, small paper creations decorated with crayon drawings and glitter that rose uncertainly into the night sky like tentative prayers. Miss Marple watched as parents lifted their offspring onto shoulders, pointing at the ascending lights that drifted eastward on a gentle breeze she hadn't noticed until the lanterns made it visible. "Now, for the special presentations," Dorothy Fletcher announced, her voice carrying that forced brightness of someone maintaining composure through sheer determination. "Our community leaders will release their lanterns to mark this year's dedication to village prosperity." The vicar went first, his modest white lantern bearing a simple cross rising steadily until it joined the constellation of smaller lights already dotting the darkness above. Dr. Haydock followed with a lantern painted with the Red Cross of Medical Service, then Mrs. Bantry with her creation featuring hand-painted roses from her garden. "And now," Dorothy's voice caught slightly, "Mr. Gerald Blackwood will release his magnificent contribution to this year's ceremony." Blackwood stepped forward with unmistakable satisfaction, accepting the long lighting taper from Thomas Reed, whose face remained studiously neutral as he performed his duty as safety coordinator. The golden lantern gleamed in the reflected light of dozens of already burning candles, its opulence somehow vulgar against the simple beauty of the homemade creations surrounding it. "My gift to St. Mary Mead," Blackwood declared loudly enough for all to hear. "May it shine as a beacon of success and prosperity for our village." He touched the taper to the candle suspended within the paper globe. For a moment, the lantern glowed from within, the gold leaf creating an almost ethereal effect as light transmitted through the decorated paper. Then, with a sound like a giant's sharp intake of breath, the lantern exploded. The concussion knocked several people backward. Burning fragments of gold-leafed paper spiraled outward like deadly confetti, but the worst of the inferno engulfed Gerald Blackwood himself. His expensive coat ignited instantly, flames racing up his body as he screamed and spun, trying desperately to escape the fire that seemed to cling to him with malevolent persistence. Thomas Reed reacted first, racing forward with a fire extinguisher, the white foam creating ghostly clouds in the orange light of the burning man. Dr. Haydock pushed through the screaming crowd, shouting for people to bring blankets, water, anything to smother the flames that had transformed Gerald Blackwood into a human torch. Miss Marple found herself pressed against the ancient oak tree by the surge of panicking villagers, but her attention remained fixed on the scene of horror unfolding before her. Through the chaos, she observed certain details that her mind automatically catalogued, the way the explosion had originated from within the lantern, rather than from the candle flame, the peculiar blue tinge to the initial fireball, the acrid smell that cut through the normal scent of burning paper. Catherine Blackwood stood frozen exactly where she had been when her husband lit the lantern, her face illuminated by the flames but showing no expression that Miss Marple could interpret. Neither horror nor satisfaction, simply a blank observation of her husband's agony. The flames were finally extinguished, leaving Blackwood collapsed on the ground, his breathing laboured and horrible to hear. Dr. Haydock worked over him with desperate efficiency, while someone had the presence of mind to telephone for an ambulance. "Clear the square," Inspector Slack's voice cut through the chaos. He had been attending the ceremony off duty, but immediately took charge. "Everyone back. Give the doctor room to work." Sarah Mills had gathered the crying children, herding them into the village hall away from the terrible scene. Harold Price stood with his camera hanging forgotten at his side, his professional instincts overwhelmed by the horror of what he had witnessed. "The accelerant," someone near Miss Marple whispered. "You can smell it. Petrol or something like it." Indeed, beneath the stench of burned flesh and melted synthetic fabric, there was unmistakably the sharp odour of petroleum. Miss Marple filed this observation away as she watched the ambulance arrive, its blue lights adding an official urgency to the nightmare that had replaced celebration. As the paramedics loaded Blackwood's still form onto a stretcher, Miss Marple noticed Dorothy Fletcher standing apart from the crowd, tears streaming down her face. But when the woman whispered something, Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the words clearly. Finally, after all this time, finally. The remaining lanterns continued to burn in their stands, their gentle light now seeming like vigil candles for something darker than anyone had intended to commemorate tonight. Chapter 3: The inspector arrives at dawn. By morning, the village square bore little evidence of the previous night's horror, save for a scorched patch of ground and the abandoned lantern stands, their paper creations now soggy with dew and tragedy. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her habit when something required her particular attention, and found Inspector Slack already present with a team of investigators. "Ah, Miss Marple," Slack acknowledged her with surprising civility. "I suppose you were present for last night's incident?" "Indeed, Inspector. Most distressing." She paused, observing the methodical collection of debris. "I understand Mr. Blackwood didn't survive the journey to hospital. Died 3 hours after admission. Shock and respiratory damage from inhaling superheated gases." Slack's expression was grim. "Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination confirms what we suspected. The lantern was deliberately sabotaged with an accelerant, aerosolized gasoline specifically, turned that paper globe into a bomb." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Which raises the question of how such a substance could be introduced into a lantern that should have contained only air, a candle, and paper." "Precisely." Slack consulted his notebook. "All lanterns were constructed yesterday at the village hall during a community crafting session. Participants made their own lanterns under supervision, but 5 volunteers were designated as safety inspectors, who checked each completed lantern before the ceremony." He listed the names: Dorothy Fletcher as ceremony organizer, Thomas Reed as safety coordinator, Sarah Mills as craft instructor, Harold Price as official photographer, needing to inspect lanterns for the best angles, and Catherine Blackwood, who had volunteered specifically to ensure her husband's expensive creation was handled properly. "Each had opportunity to tamper with Blackwood's lantern," Slack continued. "The question is which one had motive?" Miss Marple permitted herself a small, sad smile. "Inspector, in Mr. Blackwood's case, I rather think the question might be which one didn't have motive." She had spent the hours since the ceremony making discreet inquiries, and the picture that emerged of Gerald Blackwood was far from the successful businessman he projected. Rather, he appeared to have built his fortune on the ruins of others' lives. "Dorothy Fletcher's late husband," she began, "took his own life 18 months ago. He had invested his retirement savings in one of Mr. Blackwood's schemes, only to discover it was fraudulent. When he tried to expose the fraud, Blackwood somehow arranged for Mr. Fletcher to be charged with embezzlement instead. The poor man couldn't bear the shame." Slack's pencil moved rapidly across his notebook as Miss Marple continued. "Thomas Reed's construction firm, 3 generations of family business, was destroyed when Blackwood systematically stole his clients through bribery and false allegations of safety violations. Reed was forced to work as a common labourer on projects his company should have been building." She adjusted her gloves against the morning cold. "Sarah Mills had a lovely craft supply shop on the high street until Blackwood opened a competing store directly adjacent. He sold goods below cost for 6 months, until Sarah was forced into bankruptcy. The day after she closed, his prices doubled." "And Harold Price lost his commercial insurance when Blackwood, who had recently acquired the insurance company, cancelled his policy citing manufactured risk factors. Without insurance, Price couldn't maintain his studio contracts. He now survives on wedding photography and family portraits." Inspector Slack looked up sharply. "And Mrs. Blackwood?" Miss Marple's expression grew particularly grave. "Perhaps you should investigate Mr. Blackwood's frequent business trips to London. I believe you'll find he maintained another household there. Another wife, in fact, and 3 children. 12 years of bigamy, Inspector. Catherine Blackwood discovered this recently and was about to be divorced without settlement, as her husband was preparing to have her declared mentally incompetent." The inspector closed his notebook with a snap. 5 suspects, each with powerful motive and opportunity. This won't be simple." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but then murder disguised as accident rarely is. Tell me, Inspector, have your men examined the technical aspects of creating such a device? It strikes me that filling a paper lantern with gasoline vapor would require rather specific knowledge." "How do you mean?" "Well, too much accelerant would weigh down the lantern, preventing it from floating. Too little wouldn't create sufficient explosive force, and the accelerant would need to be introduced as a fine mist to remain suspended inside the lantern, rather than dripping through the paper or evaporating before the ceremony." Inspector Slack regarded her with newfound interest. You're suggesting we should look for someone with technical expertise in creating aerosols? I'm merely observing, Miss Marple replied mildly, that murder by exploding lantern requires more than motive and opportunity. It requires knowledge. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Village Hall. The village hall retained the detritus of yesterday's lantern-making session. Scattered tissue paper, dried glue spots on tables, and the lingering scent of creativity turned sinister. Miss Marple entered to find Sarah Mills attempting to restore order, her movements mechanical as she sorted supplies into boxes. "Such a tragedy," Sarah said, without looking up. "All that work, all that joy in creating something beautiful, and now it's all tainted with death." "You supervised the entire crafting session," Miss Marple observed, settling into a chair with the careful precision of age. "It must have been quite an undertaking, managing over 200 participants." Sarah's hands stilled on a roll of gold ribbon, likely left over from decorating Blackwood's ostentatious creation. "It was chaotic, honestly. Families working together, children running about with glue and glitter. We had stations set up for different stages of construction. And Mr. Blackwood's lantern? He didn't make it himself, of course." Sarah's tone carried unmistakable bitterness. "Hired an artist from London to create it in advance. It arrived yesterday morning, and we simply had to store it until the ceremony. Too important to risk amateur hands," he said. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "So, his lantern was here overnight before the ceremony?" "In the storage room. Catherine insisted on checking on it several times, said she wanted to ensure it wasn't damaged. Though between you and me, I think she was hoping someone would accidentally destroy it. She seemed almost disappointed to find it intact." The door opened, admitting Thomas Reed in his work clothes, paint stains and dust, suggesting he had come directly from a job site. He nodded to both women before addressing Sarah. "Inspector Slack wants to know about the safety equipment you used during the crafting session. Fire extinguishers and such." "Everything was properly positioned," Sarah replied defensively. "We followed all protocols Thomas established. No open flames during construction, proper ventilation for the glues, designated areas for each material." "I'm not accusing you of anything," Thomas said quietly. "Just answering the inspector's questions." Miss Marple studied him carefully. Thomas Reed was a man who worked with his hands, someone who understood materials and their properties. His construction background would certainly include knowledge of spray equipment, sealants, and various chemical applications. "Mr. Reed," she ventured, "you must work with many different substances in your construction work. Solvents, sealants, that sort of thing?" He turned his weathered face toward her, something guarded in his expression. "Part of the job. Though these days I mostly just follow orders. Haven't had my own projects since Blackwood destroyed my business." "It must have been painful," Miss Marple said gently, "watching him participate in village traditions as though he belonged here, as though he hadn't ruined so many lives." Thomas's hands clenched involuntarily. "Every time I saw him, I thought of my father. Built Reed Construction from nothing, passed it to me with such pride. 3 generations of craftsmanship destroyed by one man's lies." Sarah looked between them, her face pale. "We shouldn't speak ill of the dead." "Why not?" Thomas challenged. "Death doesn't erase what he did. Dorothy Fletcher's husband is still dead. Your shop is still gone. Harold can't even afford proper camera equipment anymore because of that man." The door opened again, this time revealing Dorothy Fletcher herself. She appeared to have aged years overnight, her usual careful appearance replaced by hastily chosen clothes and uncombed hair. "The inspector wants to interview each of us," she announced without preamble. "Separately. He's set up in the committee room." As the others prepared to leave, Miss Marple noticed something that had escaped her attention earlier. In the corner where craft supplies were stored, a small compressed air canister sat among the adhesive bottles and paper stacks, the type used for cleaning electronics or applying fine sprays of fixative to artwork, or, she reflected, for creating a fine mist of accelerant inside a paper lantern. "Mrs. Fletcher," she called softly, "might I ask you something?" Dorothy paused at the door, her expression weary. "What is it, Miss Marple?" "When you checked the lanterns for safety, what exactly were you looking for?" "Proper candle placement, secure wiring, no tears in the paper that might cause premature burning." Dorothy's voice was mechanical, rehearsed. "We wanted to ensure each lantern would rise properly and burn safely." "And Mr. Blackwood's lantern?" Dorothy's face hardened. Was perfect, of course. Everything about Gerald Blackwood had to be perfect, even if that perfection was built on others' destruction. She left before Miss Marple could respond, but her words lingered in the air like an accusation, or perhaps a confession. Chapter 5. The Photographer's Darkroom. Harold Price's photography studio occupied a narrow building on a side street, squeezed between a shuttered bakery and a charity shop. Miss Marple found him in his darkroom, the red light casting dramatic shadows as he developed photographs from the ceremony, the ones taken before horror replaced celebration. "I thought everything was digital now," she observed, careful not to disturb his work. "For commercial work, yes," Harold replied, not looking up from the developing tray. "But I still prefer film for anything that matters. You can't delete film accidentally, or intentionally." The photographs hanging on the line revealed the ceremony's progression, families arriving, children's excited faces, the lanterns waiting on their stands. Gerald Blackwood featured prominently, his satisfaction evident even in still images. "You must have photographed many ceremonies over the years," Miss Marple ventured. 15 years of lantern lightings." Harold moved a print to the fixing solution. "Started when I still had the commercial studio, when I could afford assistants and proper equipment. Now it's just me and whatever second-hand gear I can manage." Mr. Blackwood's actions affected many in the village. Harold's laugh was bitter. "Affected? He destroyed us systematically. Did you know he bought my insurance company just to cancel my policy? Claimed my chemicals were a fire hazard, said my client traffic was excessive for the building. All fabricated, but try fighting a man with unlimited legal resources." He lifted a photograph from the developer, revealing Catherine Blackwood standing apart from her husband, her expression captured in a moment of unguarded loathing. "She knew," Harold said quietly, "about the London family. She hired a private investigator months ago. I processed the surveillance photographs for her. Another life, another family, another Mrs. Blackwood who had no idea she was sharing her husband with someone else." Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. That must have been devastating for her. "She came here crying one day, begging me to destroy the photographs. Said if Gerald found out she knew, he'd have her committed. He'd already been setting the groundwork, telling people she was unstable, paranoid. Classic gaslighting. Yet she volunteered to inspect his lantern." Harold hung the photograph to dry. "Said she wanted to ensure it was perfect for his big moment. Though looking back, there was something odd about how she phrased it. She said she wanted his moment to be exactly what he deserved." Miss Marple absorbed this information while examining the darkroom's equipment. Various chemicals lined the shelves, including several spray bottles for applying fixatives and cleaning solutions. Anyone familiar with photography would understand aerosols and their properties. "Mr. Price, did you notice anything unusual when you inspected the lanterns yesterday?" He paused in his work, considering. Thomas Reed was very particular about checking each lantern, more thorough than previous years. He had some kind of spray bottle, said he was applying a fireproofing solution to the more delicate decorations. "A fireproofing solution?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did he apply this to Mr. Blackwood's lantern?" "I couldn't say. Catherine had already inspected it by the time I saw it, and she said it didn't need any additional treatment. She was quite insistent about that." The red light couldn't disguise Harold's sudden pallor as the implications of his words became clear. "You think one of us did it," he said. "You think someone deliberately murdered Blackwood." "What I think," Miss Marple replied carefully, "is that Mr. Blackwood's death was no accident. The question remains who had both the means and the knowledge to create such a device." Harold returned to his photographs, but his hands trembled slightly. "We all hated him. Every one of us had reason to want him dead. But there's a difference between wishing someone ill and actually killing them." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "That difference is often technical knowledge and opportunity." She examined one more photograph before leaving. Thomas Reed at his inspection station, a small compressed air sprayer visible at his side. The image was slightly blurred, but the equipment was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. "Mr. Price," she said as she prepared to leave, "you might want to preserve that particular negative very carefully. I believe Inspector Slack will find it most interesting." Harold looked at the image she indicated, his face paling further as he recognized what she had seen. "Dear God," he whispered. "Thomas?" But Miss Marple had already left, her mind assembling pieces of a puzzle that was becoming increasingly clear. Chapter 6. Evidence in the Workshop. Thomas Reed's workshop stood behind his modest home, a structure that spoke of better days when Reed construction had been a thriving concern. Inspector Slack had obtained a warrant based on Miss Marple's observations, and she accompanied him as an unofficial consultant, her keen eyes taking in details that might escape official notice. The workshop was meticulously organised despite its reduced circumstances. Tools hung in designated places, materials sorted by type and purpose. It was the workspace of a craftsman who took pride in precision, even when reduced to taking whatever work he could find. "Mr. Reed," Inspector Slack began formally, "we need to examine your equipment in connection with Gerald Blackwood's death." Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression resigned rather than surprised. "I wondered when you'd come. After all, I had the knowledge, didn't I? Construction work means understanding materials, chemicals, application methods." Miss Marple moved toward a workbench where several spray devices were arranged. Each was labelled with its contents: sealant, primer, various solutions used in construction work. But one small compressed air sprayer sat apart from the others, recently cleaned but not quite thoroughly enough. "Sergeant," Slack called to his assistant, "bag this one for testing." The sergeant carefully collected the sprayer while Thomas watched without protest. His silence seemed to confirm what everyone suspected. "You were practicing," Miss Marple observed, noting sheets of paper tacked to the wall showing various spray patterns, testing how to achieve the perfect mist density. Thomas nodded slowly. "Would you like to know why?" "I believe we would," Inspector Slack replied, producing his notebook. Thomas moved to a cabinet and withdrew a folder, its contents yellowed with age. 3 generations of Reed construction expertise. My grandfather's first contracts, my father's expansion plans, my own attempts to modernise the business, all destroyed by Gerald Blackwood's lies. He spread the documents across the workbench. Contracts, letters, legal notices. He bribed my clients to claim safety violations, paid inspectors to find problems that didn't exist, spread rumours about inferior materials and corner cutting. By the time I could prove it was all fabricated, my reputation was destroyed. "So, you decided to destroy him," Slack stated. "I decided to give him what he deserved." Thomas's voice carried no emotion. He loved being the centre of attention, having the most expensive everything. His golden lantern was perfect. Everyone knew which one was his. Miss Marple studied the spray patterns on the wall more carefully. You calculated exactly how much accelerant would create the desired effect. Too much, and the lantern would be too heavy to lift. Too little, and it would merely burn quickly rather than explode. I needed the perfect concentration of vaporized gasoline to create a fuel-air explosion. "And your role as safety coordinator gave you access to every lantern," Inspector Slack added. Thomas nodded. "I volunteered specifically for that reason. During my inspection, I used the sprayer to inject a fine mist through the bottom opening where the candle would be inserted. The gasoline vapor would remain suspended in the enclosed space until ignition." "But others also inspected Mr. Blackwood's lantern," Miss Marple pointed out. "Catherine, Dorothy, Sarah, Harold. They inspected it before me. I was the last check before the ceremony. Standard protocol I established myself." Thomas's smile was grim. Blackwood never suspected that the safety measures designed to protect everyone would be the very mechanism of his destruction. The workshop fell silent except for the sound of evidence bags being sealed and labelled. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice quieter. "My father built this workshop, taught me everything here, said a man's craft was his honour, his reputation was his legacy. Blackwood took both. Last month I stood at my father's grave and promised I'd restore our family name." "By becoming a murderer?" Inspector Slack asked. "By removing a parasite who destroyed everything good he touched." Thomas held out his hands for the handcuffs. "I knew I'd be caught. I'm not clever enough to outwit proper investigation, but it was worth it to see him burn with the same intensity he used to destroy others' lives." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Miss Marple noticed something that gave her pause. On the workbench, partially hidden beneath the construction documents, was a receipt dated 2 days before the ceremony. It was for the purchase of gasoline, but the amount seemed far more than necessary for the single lantern. "Mr. Reed," she asked gently, "how much?" Accelerant did you purchase? Thomas glanced at the receipt. 5 gallons. I knew I'd need to practice to get the concentration right. And how much did you use in the lantern? Perhaps 2 ounces, properly aerosolized. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. 5 gallons with only 2 ounces used left a significant amount unaccounted for. Where is the rest of the gasoline, Mr. Reed? Thomas frowned. In the storage shed. Why? But when they checked, they found only empty containers, recently drained. Chapter 7. A second crime discovered. The revelation that most of the gasoline remained unaccounted for sent Inspector Slack's team into urgent action. If Thomas Reed had used only 2 ounces for Blackwood's lantern, where had the rest gone? More disturbing, why were the containers recently emptied when Thomas had been under observation since the ceremony? Miss Marple stood in Reed's storage shed, studying the empty containers while police officers searched the property. The cans showed no sign of leakage, and the shed floor was dry. Someone had deliberately removed the gasoline, but when and why? Miss Marple, Sergeant Lake called from outside. You should see this. He led her to a corner of the garden where fresh earth had been turned. It wasn't a large disturbance, perhaps 3 feet square, but it was recent enough that the morning's frost hadn't yet settled on the exposed soil. Shall we dig? Inspector Slack asked, already knowing the answer. The excavation revealed something unexpected. Burnt fragments of paper and wire, the remains of what appeared to be several lanterns. But these weren't from the ceremony. The paper showed different decorations, different construction methods. Practice runs, Miss Marple murmured, but not Mr. Reed's practice runs. She examined the fragments more carefully. One piece showed part of a painted rose that looked familiar. Another had distinctive handwriting visible on a partially burned section. Inspector, she said urgently, I believe we need to return to the village hall immediately, and we should bring Mrs. Fletcher. They found Dorothy Fletcher in her home, packing boxes with mechanical efficiency. She showed no surprise when Inspector Slack appeared at her door. I wondered when you'd realise, she said simply. Thomas was so obvious about it, wasn't he? All that practice, that meticulous planning. But he only thought about killing Blackwood. He didn't think about what came after. Mrs. Fletcher, Miss Marple said gently, what did you do with the gasoline? Dorothy's composure finally cracked. I couldn't let Thomas hang for killing that monster. So I took the evidence, burned my own practice lanterns along with his extra materials. I'd been planning the same thing, you see. We just had the same idea at the same time. Inspector Slack looked stunned. You were both planning to kill Blackwood? Half the village probably considered it at some point. Dorothy's voice was hollow. But Thomas and I had lost the most. Our lives, our loved ones. I'd prepared my own device, but when I saw Thomas had already done it, I decided to protect him instead. She led them to her kitchen, where she pulled out a drawer to reveal her own compressed air sprayer, identical to Thomas's. I bought mine the same day he bought his. We must have passed each other at different suppliers. You could have killed him yourself during your inspection, Slack pointed out. I lost my nerve. Tears finally came, streaming down Dorothy's weathered face. I stood there with his lantern in my hands, the sprayer in my pocket, and I couldn't do it. Not in cold blood, but Thomas. Thomas had the courage I lacked. Miss Marple studied Dorothy's face, seeing not a killer, but a woman destroyed by grief who had tried to protect someone she saw as a fellow victim. You tampered with evidence in a murder investigation, Inspector Slack stated. That's a serious crime. I know, Dorothy wiped her eyes. But Thomas gave my husband justice. The least I could do was try to protect him. Except, Miss Marple interjected quietly, Mr. Reed doesn't want protection gained through someone else's sacrifice. He confessed freely, accepting the consequences of his actions. The room fell silent as the weight of this observation settled. 2 people, unknown to each other, had planned identical murders. One had succeeded, while the other had faltered, then tried to protect the successful killer. There's more, Dorothy said suddenly. Catherine Blackwood knew too. Not about the murder, but about her husband's plans for her. He was going to have her committed on Boxing Day, had already signed papers with a private asylum, claiming she was delusional about him having another family. But he did have another family, Slack protested. Yes, but he'd hidden the evidence so well that she'd never be able to prove it. Her private investigator's photographs mysteriously disappeared from Harold's studio last week. Harold was too frightened to report the theft. Miss Marple felt pieces clicking into place. Mrs. Blackwood's inspection of the lantern. She wasn't checking its condition. She was deciding whether to add her own accelerant. Dorothy nodded. I saw her with a small bottle. She stood there for the longest time, then put it back in her pocket unused. Like me, she couldn't quite do it. The tragedy was deepening with each revelation. 3 separate people had independently planned to murder Gerald Blackwood on the same night, but only one had followed through. Chapter 8. The Widow's Tale. Catherine Blackwood received Inspector Slack and Miss Marple in her drawing room, a space that spoke of wealth without warmth, decorated with expensive items that seemed chosen for their cost rather than their beauty. She was dressed in black, but her widow's weeds seemed more like armour than mourning clothes. I suppose you've come about the bottle Dorothy saw, she said without preamble. Yes, I had accelerant. Yes, I considered using it. No, I didn't kill my husband, though I'm not sorry someone did. Inspector Slack began his formal questioning, but Miss Marple watched Catherine's hands. They were perfectly steady as she poured tea, showing none of the tremor that often betrayed guilt or fear. Tell us about the other family, Miss Marple suggested gently. Catherine's composure cracked slightly. 12 years. He'd been married to her for 12 years while married to me for 15. 3 children who bear his name, who call him father, who have no idea their entire existence is built on a lie. She moved to a writing desk and withdrew a folder. Here's what's left of the evidence. Gerald stole most of it from Harold's studio, but I kept copies hidden. Margaret Blackwood, she calls herself, lives in Belgravia with the children. He spent half his time there, claiming business trips. The photographs showed a younger woman with 3 children, all bearing Gerald's distinctive features. Family portraits on holidays, school events, a complete parallel life maintained with meticulous deception. He was planning to have me committed, Catherine continued. I found the paperwork in his study, a private asylum in Scotland where inconvenient wives could be kept quietly medicated while husbands claimed their estates. When did you discover this? Inspector Slack asked. 3 days before the ceremony. That's when I decided to volunteer as a lantern inspector. I thought it would give me the perfect opportunity. But you didn't take it, Miss Marple observed. Catherine's laugh was bitter. I stood there with his golden monstrosity in my hands, the bottle of lighter fluid in my pocket, and I realized something. Killing him would make me like him, someone who destroyed others for personal gain. I couldn't do it. Yet you said nothing when you realized the lantern had been tampered with. How could I have known? It looked perfect, smelled normal. Thomas was very clever about it. Miss Marple wasn't entirely convinced. You inspected it last among the volunteers. You didn't notice anything unusual? Catherine hesitated. There was a slight chemical smell, but I attributed it to the adhesives used in construction. Should I have realized? Perhaps. Did I choose not to investigate further? Possibly. That's tantamount to being an accomplice, Inspector Slack warned. Is it? Catherine challenged. I had no certain knowledge a crime would be committed. I took no action to assist it. I merely failed to prevent something I couldn't have been sure would happen. The legal complexities were evident, but Miss Marple was more interested in the moral ones. 3 people had wanted Gerald Blackwood dead badly enough to plan his murder. That 2 had faltered spoke to their essential humanity, while Thomas Reed's follow-through spoke to desperation beyond bearing. What will happen to the London family? Miss Marple asked. Catherine's expression softened slightly. I've contacted Margaret through a lawyer. She had no idea about me. We're working together to sort out the estate. The children shouldn't suffer for their father's crimes. That's very generous of you, Miss Marple observed. It's practical. Fighting would only enrich lawyers and destroy what little good might come from this mess. Margaret and I are both victims of Gerald's deception. Inspector Slack closed his notebook. I'll need formal statements from everyone involved, including those who planned but didn't execute murders. Will Dorothy be charged? Catherine asked. That's for the prosecutors to decide. Destroying evidence is serious, but given the circumstances... Slack shrugged. As they prepared to leave, Catherine called after them. Miss Marple, do you think Thomas was wrong to kill Gerald? Miss Marple paused at the door. I think Mr. Reed was driven to an extreme that no one should have to reach. The real tragedy isn't that Gerald Blackwood died, but that he lived in such a way that made his death seem like justice to so many. Outside, Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple. 3 potential killers for one victim. I've never seen anything like it. No, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect if we investigated further we might find even more who had considered it. Mr. Blackwood created a community of victims, and eventually one of them struck back. Chapter 9. The Confession Complete. The police station's interview room was stark and official, a marked contrast to the festive decorations visible through its single window. Thomas Reed sat across from Inspector Slack, having waived his right to legal counsel with the calm of a man who had already accepted his fate. Miss Marple had been permitted to observe, her presence a courtesy acknowledging her role in uncovering the truth. She sat quietly in the corner, her hands folded, watching as Thomas provided his complete confession with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to construction projects. "I started planning 6 months ago," Thomas began, his voice steady. "The anniversary of my father's death. He'd given up when the business collapsed, just stopped eating, stopped caring, watching him fade away while Blackwood thrived. That's when I knew someone had to stop him." "Why the lantern ceremony specifically?" Inspector Slack asked. "It was perfect. Public enough that everyone would see his downfall, his precious reputation literally going up in flames. The golden lantern was so typical of him, making even a simple village tradition about his wealth and superiority." Thomas explained the technical details with professional pride. He'd researched fuel air explosions, tested different concentrations, calculated the precise amount needed for maximum effect while maintaining the lantern's ability to float initially. "I wanted him to release it himself," Thomas continued, "to light his own funeral pyre, so to speak. The few seconds of glory as his golden lantern glowed, then the horror as it exploded. He needed to know, in that moment, that his greed had finally caught up with him." "Did he know?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "In those final seconds, did he understand?" Thomas met her eyes. I saw his face just before the explosion. There was a moment of recognition, of fear. He knew something was wrong. Whether he knew it was deliberate, whether he knew it was justice. I hope so. Inspector Slack documented every detail, but then Thomas revealed something unexpected. I wasn't alone in my planning, though I didn't know it at the time. I'd been thinking about Dorothy's actions, about Catherine's preparations. We were all circling the same solution independently. "You couldn't have known about their plans," Slack pointed out. "No, but looking back, there were signs. Dorothy always went quiet when Blackwood was mentioned. Catherine started volunteering for village activities she'd previously avoided. Harold took photographs of Blackwood obsessively, like he was documenting evidence." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, do you regret your actions?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I regret that it came to this. I regret that the law failed to stop Blackwood through proper channels. I regret that my father died thinking our family name was ruined. But killing Blackwood himself? No. He was a cancer in this village, destroying everything good he touched." "You've destroyed your own life in the process," Inspector Slack observed. "You'll likely spend the rest of it in prison." "Perhaps. But Reed Construction's reputation dies with honor rather than shame. I acted to protect others from suffering as my family suffered. That's what builders do, Inspector. We create and protect. Sometimes that means removing what's harmful." The interview continued for another hour, documenting every detail for the prosecution. Thomas never wavered, never attempted to minimize his actions or shift blame. He'd committed murder with premeditation and accepted the consequences with dignity. As they concluded, Miss Marple asked one final question. "Mr. Reed, what would your father think of what you've done?" Thomas's composure finally cracked slightly, tears forming in his eyes. "I think he'd understand. He taught me that a man protects his community, stands up to bullies, fights for what's right. The methods were extreme, but the motivation, he'd understand that." Outside the interview room, Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple. "It's strange. I should feel satisfaction at solving the case, but instead I feel conflicted." as you should, Miss Marple replied. Mr. Reed is guilty of murder, but Gerald Blackwood was guilty of destroying lives through legal means. The law failed those people, and one of them took justice into his own hands. You sound like you approve, Slack said, surprised. I neither approve nor disapprove, Inspector. I simply observe that when the law fails to protect the vulnerable from predators, eventually someone will act outside the law. It's not right, but it's human nature. Sarah Mills was waiting in the station's reception area. She stood as they emerged. Is it true? She asked. Thomas killed Blackwood? He's confessed, Inspector Slack confirmed. Sarah's expression was unreadable. We'll petition for leniency, the whole village will. Thomas Reed is a good man driven to extremity. Blackwood was the real criminal. As she left, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of it all. A village tradition meant to bring light and joy had become the vehicle for murder, but perhaps in the darkness of that act, some form of justice had been served. Chapter 10. Light returns to St. Mary Mead. 1 year later, Miss Marple stood again in the village square on December 20th, watching preparations for the annual lantern lighting ceremony. The tradition had survived the previous year's tragedy, though with new safety protocols and a more subdued atmosphere. The winter air carried the same crisp clarity as that terrible night, but the mood among the gathering villagers was markedly different. Thoughtful rather than celebratory, unified rather than divided by social standing. Dorothy Fletcher had returned to organise the event, having received a suspended sentence for destroying evidence. The judge had shown leniency, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances and her genuine grief over her husband's death. She moved through the square with quiet efficiency, the ghost of her former cheerfulness occasionally flickering through when children showed her their handmade lanterns. She'd instituted new rules. No lantern could cost more than £10 to make, and all must be crafted by hand in the village hall, where everyone could witness their creation. Catherine Blackwood, no longer using her married name and having reverted to Catherine Winters, had moved to London to be closer to Margaret and the children. The two women had formed an unlikely alliance, raising Gerald's children together while trying to shield them from their father's legacy. She'd donated the insurance money from Gerald's death to establish a fund for villagers who'd lost their businesses to predatory practices. The fund had already helped 7 families restart their lives. Harold Price had reopened his commercial studio with a loan from Catherine's fund. His photographs of tonight's ceremony would be different from previous years, focusing on individual faces and moments of joy rather than the spectacle of ascending lights. He'd spent the afternoon teaching children how to capture emotion in photography, sharing his craft with a generosity that Gerald Blackwood had nearly extinguished. Sarah Mills stood with a group of children, teaching them to fold paper for their lanterns. Her craft supply shop had reopened in a smaller location, sustainable now without Blackwood's competition. She'd never spoken publicly about the murder, but she'd visited Thomas Reed every week in prison, bringing him art supplies and news from the village. Through their correspondence, she'd learned he was teaching origami to other inmates, finding peace in the precise folds and delicate beauty of paper art. The prison visitor's log had become a testament to the village's complex feelings about Thomas Reed. Nearly every family affected by Gerald Blackwood had made the journey at least once, not to celebrate what he'd done, but to acknowledge the desperate circumstances that had driven him to it. Even Inspector Slack had visited, off-duty and unofficial, struggling to reconcile the law he served with the justice he couldn't help but recognise. Thomas himself had been sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The judge had acknowledged the provocation and the widespread victim impact statements from villagers, but murder remained murder in the eyes of the law. He'd begun teaching construction skills to other inmates, finding purpose in passing on his knowledge. His workshop in the prison had become a place of learning and redemption, where broken men learned to build rather than destroy. It's different this year, Mrs. Bantry observed, joining Miss Marple near the old oak tree. More subdued, more thoughtful, but perhaps more genuine too. Perhaps that's appropriate, Miss Marple replied, watching a young mother help her daughter attach a paper angel to her simple lantern. Last year taught us that even our most innocent traditions can harbour darkness. Better to acknowledge that than pretend otherwise. Dr. Haydock appeared, carrying his own lantern decorated with medical crosses rendered in careful brushstrokes. At least this year I can be confident no one will explode, he said, with grim humour, that didn't quite mask the trauma that still lingered in his eyes. The new safety inspections are quite thorough. Perhaps too thorough, but I'd rather err on the side of caution. The doctor had struggled more than most with the aftermath. He'd treated Gerald Blackwood in those final terrible hours, fighting to save a man he'd personally despised. The oath he'd taken as a physician had compelled him to try everything, even as part of him understood Thomas Reed's motivation. The conflict had aged him visibly, adding lines to his face that spoke of moral complexity no medical training had prepared him for. As 7 o'clock approached, the villagers gathered in a large circle rather than the previous year's formal arrangement. Each person held their lantern, but there was no hierarchy, no special presentations, no golden monstrosities to overshadow humble creations. Everyone would release their lanterns simultaneously, a collective gesture rather than individual display. It was Dorothy's idea, a way to ensure that the ceremony belonged to everyone equally. "Before we begin," Dorothy announced through her megaphone, her voice carrying across the square with newfound authority, "let's observe a moment of silence for those we've lost, for those who've suffered, and for hope that such tragedy never visits us again." The square fell silent except for the winter wind rustling through bare trees. Miss Marple thought of Thomas Reed in his prison cell, probably aware of the time and remembering. She'd received a letter from him just yesterday, written in his precise hand. "I watch the sky at 7 each December 20th. Even through prison bars I can sometimes see a star or two. I imagine them as lanterns rising peacefully, carrying wishes that are pure and untainted by revenge. That's what I should have seen that night. Beauty instead of opportunity. But I was too consumed by rage to recognize the difference." She thought of Gerald Blackwood's victims, slowly rebuilding their lives with the help of Catherine's fund and their own resilience. The Hendersons had reopened their bookshop. The Weatherbys had started their bed and breakfast again. Even old Mr. Trimble had found the courage to begin painting again after Blackwood's art fraud had nearly destroyed his confidence along with his savings. "Now," Dorothy called, her voice stronger, "let's send our lights into the sky, not to guide anyone's way, but to remember that even in darkness we can create moments of beauty together." The lanterns rose together, 200 points of light ascending into the clear December night. They drifted eastward on the wind, their glow reflected in the watching faces below. Children pointed and laughed with innocent joy. Couples held hands in renewed appreciation of simple pleasures. Elderly residents remembered ceremonies past, while acknowledging how this one had been forever changed. Miss Marple noticed Margaret Blackwood standing at the edge of the crowd with her 3 children, Gerald's London family. The eldest, a boy of 11 who looked startlingly like his father, watched the lanterns with wonder, untainted by knowledge of how his father had died at this very ceremony. Catherine stood beside them, her hand on Margaret's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Miss Marple," Margaret called softly, approaching with uncertain steps. "Catherine said I should come, that it would help the children understand their father's death, without really understanding it, if that makes sense." "And has it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "They think it was an accident, a terrible accident at a beautiful ceremony. Catherine and I agreed they needn't know the truth until they're older, perhaps not ever if we can help it." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, watching the youngest child, a girl of 6, clap her hands as the lantern spiraled upward, "protecting innocence is its own form of justice." The ceremony continued for another half hour with villagers singing traditional carols as their lanterns disappeared into the darkness. When the last visible light had vanished, people began to drift away, but not with the hurried efficiency of previous years. They lingered, talking in small groups, sharing thermoses of tea and coffee, rebuilding the community bonds that Gerald Blackwood had so nearly severed. Harold Price approached Miss Marple with a photograph he'd just developed using a portable printer. It showed her watching the lanterns, her face illuminated by their collective glow, expression thoughtful and slightly sad. "I thought you might like this," he said. "You see everything, Miss Marple, but rarely get to see yourself seeing." She accepted the photograph with gratitude, noting how Harold had captured not just her image, but the weight of knowledge she carried. The understanding of how thin the line between justice and revenge could be, how good people could be driven to terrible acts, how evil could flourish when law and morality diverged. As she walked home through the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple passed the memorial garden that had been planted where Gerald Blackwood had died. The scorched earth had been covered with winter roses and evergreen shrubs, plants that would bloom even in the coldest seasons. A small plaque read simply, "In memory of all who have suffered, in hope of redemption and renewal." She paused there, remembering the horror of that night, the explosion, the screams, the smell of burning flesh and gasoline, but also remembering the revelations that followed. 3 separate people driven to contemplate murder, a community united in its suffering, and ultimately a single man taking upon himself the burden of becoming what he despised in order to remove what he saw as a cancer. Thomas Reed had turned a celebration of light into an instrument of death, corrupting innocence for the sake of vengeance. Yet his actions had freed a community from a predator the law couldn't touch. The moral complexity of it troubled her, as it should trouble anyone who believed in both law and justice. In her considerable experience with murder, she'd rarely encountered a case where the victim was so universally reviled, where the killer was so widely supported, where the act itself was both absolutely wrong and completely understandable. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Marple?" She turned to find Father Timothy, the village priest, walking his elderly dog. He'd been notably absent from the ceremony, and she thought she understood why. "Father," she acknowledged, "a difficult night for you, I imagine." "Indeed. How does one reconcile 'thou shalt not kill' with a murder that possibly saved future victims? How does one counsel forgiveness when the dead man destroyed so many lives with such casual cruelty? I've prayed about it for a year and found no easy answers." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the absence of easy answers is itself the answer. That human nature is too complex for simple moral absolutes, that sometimes we must hold multiple truths simultaneously, that murder is wrong, that Thomas Reed is guilty, that Gerald Blackwood was evil, that justice and law don't always align." Father Timothy nodded slowly. "I visited Thomas last month. He asked for my blessing. I couldn't give it, but neither could I condemn him. I simply sat with him in his cell, 2 flawed humans trying to make sense of senseless things." As they parted ways, Miss Marple continued her journey home, her mind turning over the year's events like a jeweller examining a complicated stone. The village had survived, had perhaps even grown stronger through shared trauma and mutual support. The lantern ceremony had been reclaimed, transformed from a display of wealth and status into a genuine community gathering. But the cost had been profound. Thomas Reed would spend his best years in prison. Gerald Blackwood's children would grow up without a father, knowing eventually that he was murdered. Dorothy Fletcher would carry the weight of her attempted crime and her destruction of evidence. Catherine and Margaret would raise children born of bigamy and deception. Yet, perhaps that was the most important lesson. That knowledge of evil shouldn't prevent the celebration of good, that awareness of darkness makes light more precious, and that sometimes in the complex tapestry of human nature, justice comes in forms the law cannot recognize, but the heart understands. As she reached her cottage, Miss Marple turned for one last look at the sky where the lanterns had vanished. Somewhere she knew those paper creations were falling back to earth, some landing in fields, others in streams, a few perhaps travelling miles before coming to rest. They would be found tomorrow or next week or next month, sodden and torn, their brief moment of beauty expired. But tonight, for those precious minutes when they'd risen together into the darkness, they'd been pure light ascending, a collective expression of hope despite horror, beauty despite brutality, community despite conflict. And perhaps that was enough. Not redemption, not forgetting, but a small gesture toward healing that would take years to complete if it ever truly could be. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple made tea and settled into her favourite chair. On the table beside her lay Thomas Reed's letter and Harold's photograph. She looked between them, the words of a killer seeking understanding and the image of herself seeking truth. Both were part of the same story, a tale of how the most innocent traditions could become weapons, how the most justified anger could become murder, how the most broken communities could still find ways to create moments of light. Thank you for joining me tonight on Velvet Clues. I hope this tale has reminded you that even in our most cherished traditions, human nature remains complex and capable of both tremendous beauty and terrible darkness. That justice and law are not always the same thing. That communities can survive their worst moments and perhaps emerge stronger, though forever changed. And that sometimes, when we send our lights into the sky, we're not just making wishes, we're making choices about who we are and who we want to be. Until next time, dear listeners, may your own lights rise peacefully into the night, and may you never have to choose between law and justice, between revenge and resignation, between the darkness that destroys and the darkness that paradoxically illuminates.